Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at a really fascinating, maybe even surprising, connection in philosophy. We're digging into Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yeah, it's quite the pairing. On the surface, you see Nietzsche pretty much dismissing Fichte, right?
Yeah.
Called him mediocre, things like that.
Exactly, open hostility.
But if you actually get under the hood, look at the mechanics of their thinking about subjectivity, about what the self fundamentally is. Well, the foundations are startlingly similar, almost identical in some ways.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. Let's uncover those shared roots, how they both threw out the idea of a fixed soul, how they define the self as just relentless activity, as striving.
Mm-hmm. And then we zero in on where things diverge, because there were these subtle but absolutely crucial differences in how they thought about, say, our drives, our psychology.
And conscience too, yeah.
And conscience, absolutely. And it's these differences that ultimately forced them down completely opposite political paths. It's like an intellectual detective story, really.
How tiny shifts in philosophy lead to huge real-world consequences. We end up with Fichte pushing for essentially democratic equality.
And Nietzsche arguing for a kind of strict aristocratic hierarchy. It's a stark contrast. And the puzzle for you, listening, is that both thinkers genuinely believed their path was for the overall betterment of humanity. But their solutions just can't coexist.
So let's start where they agree. They both needed to clear the ground first, right? Get rid of this traditional idea of a fixed, substantial self.
Yeah, the old soul-like substratum, or the Descartes' res cognitans, the thinking thing. This was bedrock philosophy for centuries.
And Fichte and Nietzsche both just said nope.
Pretty much. It's the essential first move for both of them.
Yeah.
They need to get rid of that static thing to make room for a dynamic self. For Fichte, this critique comes under the heading of, well, what he calls dogmatism.
Now, dogmatism, we usually think of someone being stubborn, but for Fichte, it's a specific philosophical error, isn't it?
Exactly. It's very specific. For Fichte, dogmatism is any system that assumes our perception, our knowledge, comes from external things in themselves, just sort of pressing onto our minds.
Like reality imprinting itself on a passive receiver.
Precisely. And that assumption requires a substantial self, a kind of passive background thing, the soul for thoughts or actions to happen in.
Yeah.
If dogmatism holds, the self is just another object, another thing.
And for Fichte, the problem with that isn't just abstract metaphysics, it's deeply practical. It's about freedom.
That's the absolute core for him. If the self is just a substance, like a rock or a tree, then it's just part of the causal chain of nature. It's determined. And then, well, genuine freedom, real autonomy becomes impossible.
He warns it makes us just a thing yoked within a closed chain of phenomena. It takes away responsibility.
It totally alienates us from our own actions.
Yeah.
If you accept that dogmatic view, you lose your power to posit yourself, to be the source of your activity. Fichte says the dogmatist is literally in danger of losing himself.
So to guarantee freedom, the self has to be something else, not a thing, but what?
Pure activity, a self-positing I, something that isn't grounded in anything external, but generates itself through its own act. That's the only way for Fichte to secure the possibility of genuine moral freedom.
I guess the question that pops up for me, though, is how does he really make that leap? I mean, the world still exists. The not I is still pushing back. How is this self-positing not just wishful thinking?
That's the tightrope Fichte walks, isn't it? His argument rests on the idea that this initial act of self-positing, the I am I, is something we grasp immediately, pre-reflectively. It's not inferred, it's just there.
A kind of foundational certainty.
Exactly. We just know we're free, because the alternative being just a determined link in a chain feels, well, morally and practically incoherent. The self must be its own activity, otherwise nothing makes sense in the realm of ethics and action.
Okay, so Fichte clears the ground to make space for freedom. Now, Nietzsche, he's doing a similar demolition job, but his target seems slightly different. He goes after language itself.
Yeah, that's a key difference in approach. Nietzsche famously says there's no being behind the doing. The doer is just invented as an afterthought.
The doing is everything.
Right. And he pins the blame for this invention squarely on grammar, on language habits. We think the subject I must come before the predicate, think, I think. But Nietzsche says, hang on, that's just how our sentences are built. It's not some deep metaphysical truth.
It's an interpretation, not a certainty.
It's just a habit of thought projected onto reality. He gives that great analogy, doesn't he?
It's lightning and the flash.
Exactly. We see the flash, and our grammar makes us invent a separate doer called lightning that causes the flash. But there isn't a lightning behind the flash. The flash is the lightning. The doing is the thing.
So if the I is just a grammatical fiction, like the lightning behind the flash, what does that do?
It pulls the rug out from under traditional morality. If there's no stable, enduring doer, no fixed self or soul, well, who exactly is responsible for actions over time? Who carries the burden of sin or guilt?
So Nietzsche's motivation isn't primarily about securing future freedom like Fichte's. It's about naturalizing morality, undoing past guilt.
Precisely. He wants to get rid of that metaphysical anchor, the stable soul, that allows us to predicate enduring responsibility, sin, debt. If I'm just this ever-changing flux of forces, this momentary configuration of drives, how can you legitimately hold me accountable for something I did years ago?
He saw that concept of the soul as the bedrock for guilt, conscience, the whole history of moral debt that he thought was so damaging.
Absolutely. He thought it was maybe the most crippling idea in Western history. So you see the shared move, get rid of the fixed substantial self. But the reasons are different. Fichte wants freedom forward the self as responsible activity. Nietzsche wants to erase guilt backward the self as just activity without that fixed point for blame.
But the result is the same, conceptually at least. The stage is cleared. Subjectivity isn't a thing anymore. It's got to be. Energy, activity, process.
And that leads us right into their shared positive view. Okay, no fixed soul. So what is the self? For both, it's pure activity and striving. It's what you do constantly, not what you are statically.
Fex's definition is almost dizzying, isn't it? The I is nothing other than an acting toward itself.
Yeah, it's this loop where the acting and the product of the acting are one. He says the I is at the same time the acting thing das Tätig, and that which is produced through the activity. Action and deed are one and the same.
So the self is like this engine that's constantly building itself while it runs.
That's a good way to put it. It's perpetually becoming itself through its own activity. And crucially, this activity is never restful. It's always striving.
Striving against what? Or for what?
Striving to deal with otherness, to incorporate it, master it. Fichte talks about this as an infinite longing seinen, and it's powered by what he calls the drive for determination, Trieb zum Bestimmen.
Okay, let's unpack that. Drive for determination. It sounds kind of intellectual, but you said earlier it's also aggressive.
Oh, fundamentally. This tribe isn't just about passively understanding the world, the not I. It's about actively engaging with it, trying to negate its foreignness, its otherness.
How does it do that?
By trying to make the external world conform to the I's own internal laws, its ways of thinking and acting. It's about reducing the foreign to the familiar, making the not I fit the I's categories.
So even just perceiving the world, understanding it, is an active, maybe even forceful act. We're not just taking in data, we're imposing our structure onto it.
That's exactly Fichte's point. We're trying to make the world our world, shaping it through cognition, and the world, the not I, pushes back. It resists.
And that resistance is important.
Crucial. That resistance is what forces the I to keep acting, keep striving. Without that tension, the I would just collapse back into being a passive thing. The struggle is the existence of the active self.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, this idea of an active, organizing, almost aggressive striving, it sounds remarkably like Nietzsche's core concept.
The will to power. Absolutely. The parallels are striking. Nietzsche defines the will to power, fundamentally, as a will to organization.
Not just raw power, but organization.
Yes, and this involves a lust to overpower, überwältigen wollen, and to incorporate einverleiben things it finds useful. It takes external things and makes them auxiliary parts of itself, organizing them under its own command. It's life's basic drive to grow, shape, expand.
So, is this will to power mainly about physical survival, or does it operate on the level of thought and knowledge too, like Fichte's drive?
Very much on the level of thought. This is a huge point of convergence. For Nietzsche, even basic perception Wahrnehmung is an act of will to power.
How so?
When we encounter something new, something foreign, the immediate impulse is to reduce it to something we already know, something familiar, something we've already mastered. Why? To dilate the circle of the self, as he puts it.
To expand our domain by making the unknown known.
Exactly. Knowing becomes a form of incorporation, of overpowering the foreign by fitting it into our existing structures. It mirrors Fichte's I striving to impose its laws on the not I. Knowledge isn't about passive truth-finding. It's about utility, mastery, expansion of the self.
Wow. So for both Fichte and Nietzsche, the self is this dynamic, striving, organizing force. Whether you call it the Trieb zum Bestimmen or the will to power, It's the engine driving everything.
Right. And this leads to one more crucial shared idea about the structure of this active self. Since it's not one single unified thing, what is it?
It must be complex, multiple parts.
Exactly. Both see the self as essentially a conglomeration of drives caught in a struggle to coordinate themselves into a unity. It's an internal battlefield.
Nietzsche's phrase comes to mind here, the self as a society constructed out of drives.
That sums it up perfectly for both of them. Achieving internal consistency, unity, self-mastery, which is really their version of freedom or agency, only happens when one drive, or maybe a coalition of drives, manages to take charge.
So one dominant drive needs to kind of whip the others into shape, organize them into a functioning hierarchy.
Precisely. Freedom isn't about being driveless. It's about achieving a state where your dominant drive, your core purpose, can act effectively without being constantly derailed by conflicting impulses. The internal war has to result in some kind of order.
Okay, so the self is activity, it's striving, it's incorporation, and it's an internal society of drives fighting for unity under a dominant leader. That's a pretty robust, shared picture.
It really is.
Yeah.
But now we hit the fork in the road. Because the next question is, how do you achieve that internal unity? How do you organize those drives? And that's where they start to disagree profoundly.
Right, this is the crucial juncture. How achievable is this internal coordination? And what tools do we use to discipline ourselves? They both seem to agree that some kind of conscience is needed, right?
Yes, conscience is key for both, as a mechanism for achieving that psychological unity. And they also agree it involves social interaction, some form of socialization. You don't develop it in a vacuum.
But that's where the agreement ends.
Pretty much. Their views on how conscience forms, how malleable our drives are, and crucially, the timeline involved. They're just worlds apart.
Okay, let's start with Fichte. You called him the optimist.
Relatively speaking, yes. Fichte seems to believe that human drives, the basic natural ones focused on survival, and the pure drives seeking independence, are actually quite malleable. They can be ordered, harmonized by reason.
So reason can step in and sort things out fairly effectively.
That's the idea. The ethical drive, guided by reason, can take command and bring the other drives into line. And importantly, he thinks this process of organization is largely possible within a single human lifetime.
The timeline. That's key. One lifetime is enough if you do it right.
If you have the right conditions, yes. And his idea of conscience reflects this speed and rationality. He defines conscience as the immediate consciousness of our determinate duty.
Immediate consciousness, so it's not some ancient ingrained thing.
No, it's something that arises from active, earnest moral reflection. You think seriously about your duty in a situation. You deliberate. And this feeling of conviction arises. That feeling, for Fichte, is the incontrovertible touchstone. It tells you what's right.
And because it involves reason and reflection, it needs input from others.
Absolutely. It requires free, rational intercourse with other people. You need discussion, debate, moral education, the chance to imitate virtuous others, to correct your own blind spots. That's how you cultivate this rational conscience.
And for Fichte, this rationally cultivated conscience is basically sufficient to achieve that internal harmony. It can govern the drives.
He places immense faith in it. Rational discourse leads to clear conviction, which leads to ethical action and internal order. It's a remarkably, perhaps optimistic view of reason's immediate power.
Okay, now let's pivot to Nietzsche. He's not so optimistic about reason's quick fix, is he?
Not at all. Nietzsche sees drives as far more deeply rooted, embodied, embedded. They're partly biological inheritances, shaped by millennia of evolution, and partly deeply ingrained cultural habits, acquired over long, slow historical processes.
So not easily shifted by a bit of rational reflection.
Definitely not. Because they're so entrenched, Nietzsche believes the project of deep psychological organization, of truly mastering and integrating these drives, is not something you can realistically achieve in just one lifetime.
Okay, that is a fundamental split. Fichte drives are malleable now. Nietzsche drives are deeply entrenched, needing maybe generations to reshape.
Exactly, and this completely changes the picture of conscience. For Nietzsche, conscience isn't the result of a nice philosophical chat. It's the end product of a long, often brutal, protracted process of socialization. He talks about the morality of custom, the social straitjacket. He argues that humanity was literally made predictable, made capable of having a conscience, through centuries, millennia, of harsh discipline, punishment, pain. Mnemonic techniques involving cruelty were used to burn rules into our memory, into our very physiology. Asceticism, rituals. It was about forcibly etching morality onto resistant human nature.
Wow. So Fichte's conscience is like a fresh verdict from reason, while Nietzsche's is more like an old scar,
Right.
an internalized system of historical cruelty.
That's a powerful way to put it, yes. A scar left by the tools used to make us moral. And notice the focus for Nietzsche shifts, too. He's less concerned with the content of the conscience, like, is it based on Fichte's determinative duty?
What's he focused on then?
The structure. The mere fact that some drive or set of values has achieved ascendancy. Has it successfully managed to organize the other competing drives into a hierarchy that allows for consistent action and long-term projects?
So any strong organizing principle might be valuable regardless of its specific moral flavor.
From this perspective of achieving psychological unity, yes. The goal is that internal coherence, that self-mastery, the ability to make promises and stick to them because your internal house is in order. The specific values that achieve this might vary wildly.
This really throws up a huge question, doesn't it? If Nietzsche's right, even partially, that our deepest convictions might just be the result of this long, brutal history, this cultural conditioning.
And how can Fichte be so sure that his immediate consciousness of duty is truly an incontrovertible touchstone?
Exactly. How do you trust that inner voice if it might just be the echo of some ancient chains or societal pressures?
That's precisely the problem of the intellectual conscience that Nietzsche hammers on. He demands relentless scrutiny of our own deepest values. Where did this feeling really come from? Is it authentic or just inherited conditioning? Fichte puts his faith in the feeling of conviction as the necessary ground for action.
But Nietzsche destabilizes that completely.
He does. He asks, if the very basis of your conviction is suspect, built on potentially shaky historical or psychological ground, how much probing is enough? When do you stop questioning and actually act?
It feels like you're caught. Fichte risks being maybe too trusting, acting on a potentially unexamined impulse he calls reason, like a kind of gullible assent.
Perhaps. And Nietzsche risks the opposite endless suspicion. A paranoiac scouring of every motive that could lead to paralysis, unable to trust any ground for action.
How do you find the balance? That golden mean of suspicion, as you called it earlier.
That's the million-dollar question Nietzsche leaves us with. Especially if, as he suggests, our very tools for thinking are themselves shaped by these historical power dynamics. This fundamental disagreement about psychology, about conscience, about how changeable we are, it inevitably spills over into politics.
And here we are at the political fallout. They both want the betterment of humanity somehow, but their diagnoses of human nature are so different that their prescriptions for the ideal state are just completely incompatible.
Totally incompatible. Let's start with Fichte again. Given his trust in reason, in the drives being malleable within a lifetime, what kind of state does that lead to?
It leads him to argue for an egalitarian democratic regime. He even envisions a kind of cosmopolitan world order eventually.
Right. And why democracy? Why is that not just a preference but a philosophical requirement for him?
Well, it seems to tie back to how the self even becomes aware of itself. Didn't you mention a summons?
Yes, the Aufforderung. Fichte argues that an individual can't fully realize its own freedom and rationality in isolation. It needs to be summoned into self-awareness by encountering another free, rational being.
So we need other free people around us to become fully ourselves.
Exactly. The existence of other free subjects acts like a mirror, a catalyst, helping us recognize and assert our own potential for freedom and reason. It's essential for our moral development.
Which means the state has to protect the conditions for that to happen.
Precisely. The means of cultivation for Fichte are things like free rational discussion, widespread moral education, mutual respect, and an open, democratic, egalitarian society is the best way to guarantee those things.
It promotes the communication needed to develop that rational conscience we talked about, to correct errors, to issue and receive that summons.
And being surrounded by equals, by other free rational beings, isn't just nice. Fichte sees it as a condition for one's own self-sufficiency, which is why he fundamentally rejects exploitation.
Because treating others as tools or animals undermines the very environment you need for your own rational development.
Exactly. It's self-contradictory for a rational being trying to achieve freedom. If you degrade others, you degrade the social conditions necessary for your own flourishing as a rational agent. It pulls everyone down.
So Fichte needs equality and free discourse now to help individuals achieve rational self-governance now. Okay. Now, Nietzsche takes us somewhere completely different.
Completely. He argues for a hierarchical aristocratic regime.
Why? If the goal is still human betterment, why aristocracy?
Because remember, his view of drives, deeply entrenched, needing generations to reshape. If the goal is to cultivate a higher type of human, someone with maximal internal organization, maximal will to power. That's not a short-term project.
It needs long-term planning and stability.
Exactly. It requires a systematic transgenerational effort. And that leads him to his concept of Züchtung.
Züchtung. That word sounds loaded. It means breeding.
It means breeding, yes, but also cultivation, discipline, education. It's crucial to understand it's both biological and cultural for Nietzsche. It's about selecting and intensely cultivating certain traits over many, many generations.
And who oversees this multi-generational project?
That's where the aristocracy comes in. You need a stable ruling class with a tenacious authority and long-term vision to manage this arduous process. They need to enforce the stringent discipline, the social conditioning necessary to overcome that deep-seated inertia of human drives and breed or cultivate this higher type.
This sounds like it prioritizes a future goal over present well-being.
Absolutely. The focus isn't on the happiness or freedom of the average person today. It's on achieving this pinnacle of human potential generations down the line. And this, for Nietzsche, makes exploitation not just acceptable, but necessary.
Necessary. He actually praises it, even uses the word slavery.
He does use slavery, though often meaning any system where the vast majority labor for the benefit of a select few. He argues that enhancing the overall type of man requires the sacrifice of countless people.
What's the justification for sacrificing the masses?
It's a kind of species-level utilitarianism, you could say.
Yeah.
The idea is that the majority must be reduced, turned into incomplete human beings, slaves, tools, because their labor creates the stable platform, the leisure, the resources.
That allowed the elite, the potential higher types, to dedicate themselves fully to self-overcoming, creativity, organizing their drives.
Precisely. Without that exploited base doing the grunt work, the potential geniuses would be bogged down in mere survival. The higher type needs that foundation of exploited labor to even have the chance to emerge and flourish. The sacrifice of the many serves the potential greatness of the few, which, in his view, elevates the entire human species eventually.
Goodness. It's stark, isn't it, Fichte? Immediate democracy and mutual respect, because drives are malleable now. Nietzsche. Long-term aristocracy and exploitation, because drives are entrenched and need generations of hard cultivation.
The entire political chasm opens up right there, based on that one core disagreement about how easily human nature can be changed.
So this leaves us grappling with some pretty deep dilemmas. The first one takes us back to conscience.
Yeah, the dilemma of conscience and certainty. We touched on it before. If Nietzsche's right that our convictions might be tainted by history, by conditioning,
then Fichte's reliance on that immediate consciousness of duty looks shaky. But if Nietzsche's right, how do you ever act? When does the critical self-examination stop?
it's that tightrope walk again. Where is the line between healthy skepticism and paralyzing self-doubt? Fichte gives you the certainty to act. Trust your rational conviction.
But Nietzsche warns that conviction might be a phantom, an echo of old power structures.
Right. So do you risk acting like Fichte's potential gullible agent, confident but possibly deluded? Or do you risk becoming Nietzsche's paranoid agent, endlessly dissecting motives until you can't act at all? Finding that golden mean of suspicion seems almost impossible if the ground beneath your feet is constantly shifting.
And the second big dilemma seems to be about the political preconditions themselves. What comes first?
Exactly. Do you bet on Fichte's model? Institute freedom and rational discourse now, hoping it's powerful enough to foster internal unity and ethical action in individuals.
Or do you bet on Nietzsche's model? Accept the need for potentially brutal, long-term hierarchical conditioning across generations to fundamentally reshape human nature before true freedom is even meaningful for the higher types.
Both are massive gambles, aren't they? Fichte's democratic approach risks chaos, moral relativism, maybe people just failing to live up to the demanding task of rational self-creation.
While Nietzsche's aristocratic approach risks creating, well, potentially monstrous forms of oppression, justifying cruelty in the name of a future ideal that might never arrive, or might arrive in a terrifying form.
The higher type could just end up being a more efficient tyrant, not necessarily a creator of new values in the positive sense he sometimes envisioned.
It's fascinating that both are aiming for human betterment, yet they arrive at completely opposite, mutually exclusive strategies based on that core view of human psychology.
It really highlights how assumptions about human nature drive political theory. But is it always such a stark dichotomy? You hinted earlier that maybe both thinkers saw some value in the other side's approach at times.
Right. If we look beyond just, say, Fichte's early work or Nietzsche's later work.
Exactly. The later Fichte, for instance, Grappling with the practical difficulties of educating a whole population to rational freedom immediately sometimes seems to concede the need for more structured, even somewhat authoritarian or inegalitarian institutions as a sort of temporary measure, a way to guide people towards the capacity for freedom.
So acknowledging that maybe not everyone is ready for pure rational self-governance straight away.
Something like that. And conversely, Nietzsche, especially in his middle period, occasionally saw some instrumental value in democracy.
Really? How so?
He sometimes viewed it as a useful, though ultimately transitional, force for breaking down old, ossified hierarchies, for creating a more level playing field where new talents might emerge, even if he thought democracy would eventually lead to mediocrity if left unchecked.
So maybe the practical reality forces some compromise. Could a real-world attempt to foster this kind of deep psychological coordination need elements of both?
That's the intriguing possibility, isn't it? Perhaps achieving the kind of deep, structural self-mastery Nietzsche envisioned requires some long-term stability and discipline. But achieving the ethical autonomy and rational self-awareness Fichte championed requires free discourse and mutual respect.
So you'd need a system that somehow blends the free and equitable interaction of democracy with the stability, discipline, and long-term perspective often associated with, well, more hierarchical or traditional structures.
It's a challenging thought. Maybe different spheres of life need different approaches. A space for Fichtean rational freedom nested within a structure that provides Nietzschean long-term stability. It's trying to square a very difficult circle. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, we started this deep dive highlighting a surprising convergence between Fichte and Nietzsche. This shared idea of the self as pure, dynamic activity, striving to organize its internal drives into unity.
A really revolutionary foundation they both built on. But then we saw how that foundation cracked right down the middle over one fundamental question. How malleable is human psychology?
Fichte's answer, rationally malleable within a lifetime, led straight to democracy and free discourse as the necessary tools.
While Nietzsche's answer, deeply entrenched, embodied, needing generations, demanded hierarchy, discipline, even exploitation, managed by an aristocracy over the long haul.
And that relatively small difference in their psychological assumptions creates this enormous, seemingly unbridgeable political and ethical deadlock, which leaves us and you with a final thought to chew on.
Given that both these thinkers, in their own ways, were aiming for the betterment of humanity as a whole, is it actually possible? Can we design a society, political institutions, that provide the kind of long-term stability and discipline needed for deep psychological cultivation, the kind Nietzsche thought necessary, without crushing the essential rational freedom and mutual respect that Fichte saw as non-negotiable for ethical autonomy?
It forces you to confront your own assumptions, doesn't it? How changeable do you think human nature really is? Because where you stand on that question likely shapes your entire vision of what a just and effective society looks like. Something to keep pondering.